Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Parshas Vayakhel. I wanted to talk firstly about one pasuk in Parshas Vayakhel, and it's an unusual verse. And let's see what it means. It's chapter 38, verse 8. And we know that Bezalel is making the Mishkan, and in his construction of the Mishkan, he made a kior. And the kior was a basin, and you were supposed to wash from the basin. The Kohanim, before they served, had to wash from their basin, their hands and their legs. So it says, Vayas at the kior nechoshes, that Bezalel, when he's constructing the utensils of the Mishkan, he made the basin out of copper, vet kano nechoshes, and he made the pedestal out of copper, bimarot, with the mirrors of the tzovot, Asher Tzavu Petach Omoed, with the mirrors, Hatzovot. Sovot is service, but it's in the feminine. So with the women who served at the entrance to the Ol Moed. What does that mean with the women who served at the entrance to the Ol Moed? First of all, we'll talk about the fact that the copper was what they used for mirrors back then. They used copper, which they cleaned really nicely. And that became the basin. The basin was used to purify themselves. So what did they use? They used this copper to make up the basin. But it wasn't just regular copper. It was specifically copper from the women who served. Nowhere, I'm trying to remember, but I can't think of another reference in the Mishkan where it tells us where they got a specific item. It doesn't say they got the skins from the men who slaughtered, or they got the jewelry from when they raided, the Egyptians. This is the only time in the construction of the Mishkan that the verse itself tells us where something came from. It came from the Marot Hatzovot. So it's highly unusual. Who are these women?
Rabbi?
So, yeah, hold on one second. So what are these mirrors? What's going on with them? So Rashi tells us something very beautiful, and then I want to look at the Balaturim. Rashi says, "B'marot hatzavot, b'not Yisrael hayu bi'adan marot." The Jewish girls had in their hands, in their possessions, mirrors, sheroot bahen kishehen mitkashot, that they would look at them when they would beautify themselves. V'af otan lo ikvu milahavi l'nidvat hamishkan. They were trying to bring these mirrors as a donation to the temple. Meaning to say the Jewish girls had mirrors. And they said, okay, there's a collection out. These mirrors they were using to make themselves look pretty. They said, we want to give our mirrors to the temple. Moshe rejected them. He said, I'm not accepting the mirrors. Because he says, these mirrors were made to accomplish the mission of the Yetzer Hara, of the evil inclination, meaning to say, to lead us away from sin, lead us away from the Yetzer Hara made the mirrors so that these women would tempt their husbands. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God said to Moshe, meaning to say Moshe wanted to reject any hint of the physical relationship between the husband and the wife, want to reject that from the construction of the Mishkan. God said to him, Kabel, ki elu chavivin alai min hakol. He says, accept them, because these are the most precious of all to me. Because through these mirrors, the women established Tzvaot Rabot. Remember, it says the Marot HaTzavot. It's not the mirrors of the women, it's the mirrors of the Tzvaot, means the armies, the legions in Egypt. Meaning to say, it's not the women who gathered, but it is the women who produced armies. When their husbands who were enslaved were so tired from the labor that was imposed upon them, the women would go to their husbands and bring them food and drink. And they would feed them. And they would take these mirrors. And each one would look at themselves with their husbands in the mirror. And she would entice him with words saying, I'm more beautiful than you. Meaning she was flirting with her husband. She was playing with her husband. And as a result of this, their husbands would come to desire them. And they would have relationships. And they would conceive and give birth there. As it states, under the tapuach tree, usually translated as an apple tree, but I don't know if it's literally an apple, might be a different type of fruit, but under the tapuach, I aroused you. And that's a reference to the fields where the women would go to entice their husbands. Vinasa kiyor mehem, and this basin was made from these mirrors, which was to make peace between a husband and wife. Why? Because what happens from these basins? That they would take the water from this basin and give it to the woman whose husband had warned her against seclusion with another man, the sota, Vinistra, and she became secluded. And I'll prove it to you that they're actual mirrors, because it says, shivim kikar, and it says the copper of the offering was 70 kikar. The kior v'karnoa who's kurusham, and that's a reference. And there it doesn't mention the kior and its space amongst the 70 kikar of copper. This teaches you that the copper of the kior did not come from the donated copper, but rather from the copper of the mirrors. That's what Rabbi Tanchuma expounded. With the mirrors of the woman. And that's a translation of marot. In French, mirrors. Rashi says in French it's mirrors. Okay. That's what Rashi says. So let me just summarize what Rashi's argument is. Rashi says that the verse says that the basin, the copper basin, came from the mirrors that were donated by the women who had used these mirrors to excite their husbands. Moshe Rabbeinu at first wanted to reject it, but God told him, this is the most precious gift of all, because this was what the women used to excite their husband and produce the legions of the Jewish people. That their husbands were in the middle of slavery and they were tired. And the women came and said, we can't give up. Just like when you're having a dark day or you're having a dark time to make a commitment to raising a Jewish family, producing Jewish children is the greatest act of activism. That's what Rashi is saying. So that's what this Rashi is teaching us. It's also teaching us, presumably Rashi is writing around the times where the medieval church is debating whether or not there should be a celibate priestly class, where Christianity is going through this question, and many in the Christian church and Latin Christendom are arguing that the best way is to be celibate. And Rashi here is saying, we Jewish people say, no, that into the temple, in the holiest place of the temple, we take the mirrors that were used for husbands and wives to be together. Not only that, it's in order to create more opportunities for the husband and wife to be together by returning the woman who is accused of being an adulteress, by having her drink from this so that she can return to her husband and live together again as husband and wife. This is the powerful Rashi. Let me just pause for a second to see if anybody has questions. Anybody has a question, you could raise your hand. Okay, so now go. But the Baal Turim, writing 200 years later, tells us a completely opposite approach. Completely opposite. Before I get to the Baal Turim, Chizkuni and others argue that who are these Marot Hatzofot? This was a spiritual class of women who gathered around the Mishkan and prayed and served. They were almost like a parallel to the Kohanim, but from the females. A female parallel to the sons of Aaron. And that's who was making this donation. And this is what the Baal Turim writes. Let me read to you what the Baal Turim says. B'marot, Daled b'masoret. That the word marot appears 4 times in the Tanakh. What are the other times? Vayomer Elokim Yisrael b'marot halayla. God spoke to Israel, to Jacob, in visions of the night. There, marot does not mean mirrors, it means a vision. And also says it twice in Ezekiel, b'marot Elokim, the visions, the divine visions in Ezekiel. Meaning to say, okay, maybe it means mirrors, like Rashi said, but the word marot is really a reference to spiritual visions. And what the Baal Turim says, you need to listen to this. This is just going to be incredibly powerful to hear. She'elu anoshim, that these mirrors refer to women. Saru mitai vasa olam. They removed themselves from the pleasures of the world. Vinos nu marosehan v'nidvasa mishkan. And they said, we no longer want to have physical pleasures. And they gave their mirrors to the Mishkan. V'nocha aleim ruach Elokim. And the Spirit of God rested upon them. Meaning to say, just the opposite of Rashi. These were not women who used the mirrors for physical relations with their husbands, but rather these are women who forswore sexual pleasures. That's what the implication of what the Baal Turim is. These are women who said, we want to take every ounce of physical pleasure, donate it to the temple so we can have the visions of God. That's what Rashi is saying. And so now if we take this other approach, this is almost like a monastic class of women, that women who swore off living in regular society in order to achieve a spiritual high as part of their service of Hashem. 2 different approaches, and this is the idea behind the Marot Hatzofot. Did Judaism have a monastic class of women? And this explanation of the Balaturim, which was certainly written around the time of the height of monasticism in Latin Christendom, argues that that's what these women were. So let me stop the recording here. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to.